The howling wind rattled the windows of Peter Hayes' isolated cabin, nestled deep in the outskirts of Jackson Hole, Wyoming. The retired firefighter sat in his worn leather armchair, watching as ice crystals formed intricate patterns on the glass panes. After 27 years of service, the solitude of the Rockies had become his sanctuary, a place where the memories of countless rescues could finally rest. The cabin creaked under the assault of the winter storm, its wooden bones protesting against the fierce Wyoming weather. Peter stoked the fire, watching as sparks danced up the chimney. The ritual was part of his nightly routine now, a far cry from the adrenaline-fueled life he'd led before. Sometimes, he wondered if he'd made the right choice, trading the chaos of emergency services for this self-imposed exile among the mountains. His thoughts were interrupted by a sound that didn't belong to the storm's symphony. At first, he dismissed it as wind playing tricks with his ears, but there it was again, a soft, persistent scratching at his front door. Peter's instincts, honed by decades of emergency response, instantly awakened. He reached for the flashlight he always kept within arm's reach, a habit he couldn't shake even after retirement. The scratching continued, more urgent now. Peter approached the door cautiously, his footsteps silent on the wooden floor. Through the window, the beam of his flashlight revealed only swirling snow, but the scratching persisted. With careful movements, he unlocked the door and pulled it open, bracing against the bitter wind that immediately rushed in. What he found made him catch his breath. A German shepherd stood there, her dark fur matted with ice and snow. Despite her obvious exhaustion, she maintained a protective stance over 3 small bundles of fur huddled against her sides, puppies, no more than a few months old, shivering in the bitter cold. The mother's eyes met Peter's, and in them, he saw something that stirred memories of his years of service, a desperate plea for help. Without hesitation, Peter stepped aside, gesturing them in. The mother dog seemed to understand, carefully nudging her puppies forward into the warmth of the cabin. They stumbled in on unsteady legs, leaving small wet footprints on the wooden floor. Peter quickly closed the door against the howling wind, shutting out the storm that had delivered these unexpected visitors. In the firelight, he could better assess their condition. The mother was thin, too thin for a dog of her size, and her fur bore signs of neglect. Around her neck was a crude leather collar, unlike anything Peter had seen before. The puppies, despite their obvious fatigue, began to show signs of life in the cabin's warmth, their tiny tails wagging hesitantly as they huddled close to their mother. Peter moved slowly, careful not to startle them. He retrieved some leftover venison stew from his dinner and placed it in a shallow bowl. The mother watched him intently, her eyes never leaving his movements, but she made no aggressive gestures. When he set the bowl down and stepped back, she approached it cautiously, sniffed once, then began to eat with controlled desperation. As the night wore on, Peter made beds for them near the fire using old blankets. The puppies, warmed by the flames and their mother's presence, finally fell into exhausted sleep. The mother remained awake longer, her vigilant eyes reflecting the firelight as she watched Peter move about the cabin. There was intelligence in those eyes, and something else, a wariness that spoke of experiences Peter could only guess at. Before retiring to his own bed, Peter studied the collar more closely as the dog allowed him near. In the better light, he noticed something unusual, a small metallic compartment carefully worked into the leather. Strangest of all was the fact that it seemed to have been deliberately sealed. Peter's instincts, which had saved countless lives during his career, told him there was more to these dogs than met the eye. That night, as the storm raged outside, Peter lay awake listening to the soft breathing of his unexpected guests. The mother dog had positioned herself between her puppies and the door, a guardian even in rest. The scene stirred something in Peter's heart, something he thought he'd left behind in his old life, the desire to protect, to help, to make a difference. Little did he know, as sleep finally claimed him, that the storm had brought him more than just 4 abandoned dogs. It had delivered a mystery that would shatter the peaceful solitude he'd built for himself in these mountains, challenging him to become once again the man he used to be, a protector, a fighter, a hero. If this story has captured your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like. Tell us which city you're watching from. Let's continue. Dawn broke over the Rockies, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. Peter had spent most of the night watching over his unexpected guests, his mind churning with questions about their mysterious appearance. As morning light filtered through the frost-covered windows, he began to notice details that had been hidden in the previous night's darkness. The mother dog, whom he'd started thinking of as Grace for her dignified bearing despite her condition, moved with a slight limp in her right hind leg. It wasn't a fresh injury, but rather the kind of old wound that told stories of past hardships. The puppies, three distinct personalities already emerging in the morning light, showed signs of neglect, but their spirits remained unbroken. The smallest puppy, with ash-colored fur that reminded Peter of storm clouds, was the first to venture away from Grace's protective presence. Peter watched as the little one hobbled toward him, ears perked forward with curiosity. "Well, hello there, Ash," he said softly, the name coming naturally. The other two puppies, one white as the surrounding snow and the other with russet markings like glowing embers, soon followed their siblings' lead. As Peter prepared breakfast for himself and his new companions, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about the leather collar needed investigation. Grace allowed him to approach now, seemingly having decided he could be trusted. With gentle movements, he examined the metallic compartment more closely. It was sealed tight, but there appeared to be a mechanism for opening it, if one knew how. The sound of an engine in the distance made Grace's ears prick up, her body tensing instantly. Peter moved to the window, scanning the snow-covered landscape. Through the trees, he caught a glimpse of a vehicle moving along the distant road, unusual for this remote area, especially after a storm. Grace's reaction suggested this wasn't just a random passerby. Peter's years as a firefighter had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, they were screaming that something was wrong. He watched as the vehicle, a black SUV with tinted windows, slowed near his property's entrance before continuing past. Grace remained rigid until the sound of the engine faded completely, her protective stance over the puppies speaking volumes about past experiences. Deciding to try his luck with the collar's compartment, Peter retrieved his old toolbox. As he sorted through the tools, something caught his eye, a symbol etched into the box's metal surface, worn but still visible. His hands froze as recognition hit him. It was the same symbol he'd noticed partially stamped into the collar's leather surface. The coincidence was too precise to ignore. Peter remembered buying the toolbox years ago from old Joe's salvage on the outskirts of town, never giving much thought to the marking. Now, studying it alongside the collar's imprint, he could see they were identical, a geometric pattern that looked like a combination of ancient runes and modern design. Grace watched him intently as he made the connection, her intelligent eyes following his movements. The puppies, oblivious to the tension, played nearby, their playful tumbling a stark contrast to the growing mystery. Snow, the white puppy, had discovered an old rope toy, proudly carrying it around while Ember and Ash engaged in a gentle tug-of-war with its other end. Peter's contemplation was interrupted by movement outside. Through the window, he spotted fresh tracks in the snow, human footprints circling his property, definitely not his own. They led to and from the tree line, suggesting someone had been watching the cabin. The tracks were partially filled with fresh snow, indicating they'd been made early in the morning, possibly while he'd been sleeping. Standing at the window, Peter felt the weight of his isolation for the first time since retiring. The cabin, once a sanctuary from the world's chaos, suddenly felt exposed. Grace moved to stand beside him, her posture alert, ears forward, watching the same spot where the footprints disappeared into the trees. In that moment, Peter realized that by taking in these dogs, he'd become part of something much larger than a simple rescue. The mysterious toolbox symbol, the sealed compartment in Grace's collar, the suspicious vehicle, and now the footprints, all pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed yesterday. As he watched Grace guide her puppies away from the windows, her movements deliberate and protective, Peter made a decision. He'd spent years rushing into burning buildings to save lives. He wasn't about to back down from whatever mystery these dogs had brought to his door. The small general store in Jackson Hole had always been a quiet place, but today the atmosphere felt different. Peter stood at the counter, gathering supplies while keeping one ear tuned to the conversations around him. He hadn't wanted to leave Grace and the puppies alone at the cabin, but after 3 days of caring for them, his pantry needed restocking. "Heard about them dogs again," a gruff voice caught his attention. Two men stood near the coffee machine, their conversation barely above a whisper. "Third time this month. Always the same story, expensive breeding stock just disappearing into thin air." The other man nodded, glancing around before responding. "My cousin works up at the old Miller property. Says he's seen things that don't add up. Fancy cars coming and going at all hours." Peter pretended to study the ingredient list on a can of soup while listening. The old Miller property, he knew it well. It lay about 15 miles north of his cabin, abandoned years ago after the family moved east. Or at least, that's what everyone had been told. The mention of fancy cars stirred something in his memory about the black SUV he'd seen. The bell above the door chimed, and the store fell silent. Peter turned slightly, watching through the reflection in the window as an elderly man in a wheelchair entered, pushed by a stone-faced attendant. The chair was custom-built, more sophisticated than any medical model Peter had seen before. Its occupant surveyed the store with cold, calculating eyes that belied his fragile appearance. "Mr. Werner," the store owner called out, his usually cheerful voice tinged with unease. "Wasn't expecting you today, with the road still being cleared and all." The elderly man, Werner, smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "The weather is no obstacle when there's business to attend to, Mr. Thompson. I wonder, have any of your customers mentioned seeing stray dogs in the area? I've lost some valuable animals recently." Peter kept his back turned, but every nerve in his body was alert. Werner's voice carried an accent he couldn't quite place, something European perhaps, but it was his tone that set off warning bells, too controlled, too precise. The same precision Peter had noticed in the craftsmanship of Grace's collar. "Can't say that I have," Thompson replied, his discomfort evident. "Though Pete here knows these mountains better than anyone." "Pete? You seen any strays up your way?" Peter turned slowly, meeting Werner's gaze. In that moment, he understood why Grace had been so frightened. Those eyes held no warmth, no compassion, just cold calculation. "Nothing unusual," Peter replied evenly, drawing on years of experience keeping his voice steady in crisis situations. "The storm's been keeping most creatures denayed up." Werner studied him for a long moment, his fingers drumming on the armrest of his wheelchair. The rhythmic tapping seemed to fill the entire store. "Interesting," Werner mused. "I could have sworn my men reported tracks leading to the northern areas, near where you live, if I'm not mistaken." The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Peter maintained eye contact, remembering Grace's intelligent eyes, the puppy's trust, the mysterious symbol that connected them to his past. "The mountains play tricks after a storm," Peter replied. "Easy to mistake animal tracks in fresh snow." He paid for his supplies, feeling Werner's eyes on him as he moved to the door. Just as he reached for the handle, Werner spoke again. "Mr. Hayes, it was Hayes, wasn't it? If you do happen to see any strays, I'd appreciate a call. I've left my cards with Thompson here. I take very good care of what belongs to me." The threat in those words was clear, though carefully veiled. Peter nodded once and stepped out into the cold, his mind racing. The conversation had confirmed his suspicions. Grace and her puppies were running from something dangerous, something that wouldn't stop looking for them. As he drove back to the cabin, Peter noticed a black SUV in his rearview mirror, keeping its distance but definitely following. He took a series of unnecessary turns down side roads, eventually losing it near the national forest boundary. His old training was kicking in: evaluate, adapt, protect. Reaching the cabin, Peter found Grace waiting at the window, her posture relaxing slightly at his return. The puppies bounded to greet him, their joy untouched by the growing danger. As he unloaded the supplies, his hand brushed against the old toolbox, and he made a decision. It was time to find out what was hidden in that collar's compartment, and more importantly, why someone like Werner would go to such lengths to find it. Back at the cabin, Peter spread his tools across the kitchen table, studying Grace's collar under the bright overhead light. The puppies napped near the fireplace, Snow and Ember curled together while Ash, the adventurous one, had claimed an old throw pillow for himself. Grace sat alert beside Peter, watching his every move with those intelligent eyes that seemed to hold so many secrets. The metallic compartment proved more complex than he'd initially thought. What had appeared to be a simple latch was actually an intricate mechanism, similar to a combination lock, but with subtle geometric patterns that had to be aligned just so. The symbol from his toolbox appeared again, this time etched more clearly into the metal surface. "What were you mixed up in, girl?" Peter murmured, his fingers tracing the pattern. Grace's ears perked up at his voice, and she nudged his hand with her nose. The gesture seemed almost encouraging. Looking between the toolbox and the collar, Peter noticed something he'd missed before. The symbols weren't identical, but complementary. When aligned properly, they formed a complete design. A soft click broke the silence as the compartment finally opened. Inside, Peter found a folded piece of paper, carefully sealed in waterproof material. As he gently extracted it, his hand steady from years of delicate rescue work, he realized it was part of a map. The paper was high quality, the kind used for architectural drawings, but it had been deliberately torn to separate it from a larger document. The fragment showed a detailed layout of what appeared to be a building complex, with one section highlighted in red. Coordinates were marked in the corner, and Peter's heart rate quickened as he recognized them. They pointed to the old Miller property. But this wasn't the ramshackle farm he remembered. The plan showed something far more sophisticated: underground levels, security checkpoints, and what looked like research facilities. A sudden flash of light through the window caught his attention. Grace was already on her feet, a low growl rumbling in her throat. Peter quickly moved to dim the lights, watching as a drone hovered at the edge of his property, its camera clearly directed at his cabin. The puppies, sensing their mother's tension, huddled together quietly. Peter's mind raced as he considered his options. The drone's presence confirmed his suspicions. Werner's organization was far more sophisticated than local rumors suggested. As he watched, the drone executed a precise grid pattern, methodically scanning the area. This wasn't amateur surveillance, this was military-grade technology. Moving carefully away from the windows, Peter retrieved his laptop, a habit from his firefighting days when documentation could mean the difference between life and safety. The symbol from the toolbox had been nagging at his memory, and now he knew why. Years ago, his unit had been called to a fire at a research facility outside of town. The same symbol had been on the building's security badges, though he'd been too busy with the evacuation to give it much thought at the time. A quick internet search revealed fragments of information that began to form a disturbing picture. The symbol was connected to a company called Nexus Dynamics, supposedly a pharmaceutical research firm. But buried in old news articles and forum posts were whispers of something darker: unauthorized experiments, missing animals, and local officials who suddenly dropped investigations without explanation. Grace moved to stand beside him, her body tense but controlled. In the firelight, Peter could see more clearly the old scars that marked her coat, precise, deliberate marks that spoke of something far worse than neglect or accident. The puppies, now awake, clustered around their mother, and Peter noticed for the first time how their markings seemed too perfect, too designed. A sharp crack outside made them all freeze. Through the window, Peter caught glimpses of flashlight beams moving through the trees. Grace's ears flattened against her head, but instead of cowering, she moved deliberately to the kitchen area, pawing at a specific floorboard. Peter understood immediately: she was showing him something. Carefully lifting the board, he found a hidden space beneath. Inside was a USB drive, sealed in the same waterproof material as the map fragment. Grace's eyes met his, and in that moment, Peter realized she hadn't chosen his cabin by accident. Something or someone had sent her here, to him specifically, knowing he would understand the significance of the symbol, knowing he had a connection to whatever dark secret was hidden in those mountains. The USB drive's contents confirmed Peter's worst fears. His laptop screen illuminated the darkened cabin with a ghostly glow as he scrolled through document after document, research files, experimental protocols, and most disturbing of all, genetic modification reports. The puppies weren't just perfectly marked, they had been engineered to be perfect. Grace watched the screen intently, her eyes reflecting the blue light. The documents revealed her true identity, Subject GR7, part of a program called Project Guardian. The scientific language couldn't mask the horror of what had been done, selective breeding combined with genetic enhancement, creating dogs with heightened intelligence and abilities. Grace wasn't just special, she was extraordinary by design. A series of photographs showed the Miller property as it truly was, a state-of-the-art research facility hidden beneath the facade of an abandoned farm. The complex spread deep underground, filled with laboratories and testing areas. But what caught Peter's attention were the security protocols. Every door, every checkpoint used the same geometric symbol he'd found on his toolbox. It wasn't just a logo, it was a key. The sound of vehicles approaching pulled him from his research. Grace was already moving, herding her puppies toward the back of the cabin. Peter quickly shut down the laptop and concealed it along with the USB drive. Through the window, he could see multiple sets of headlights cutting through the darkness, converging on his property. "Mr. Hayes." Werner's voice carried clearly through the night air, amplified by a speaker system. "I believe you have something that belongs to me. Let's handle this civilly." The elderly man's wheelchair was visible in the beams of the headlights, surrounded by a dozen figures in tactical gear. This was no amateur operation, these were trained professionals. Peter's mind raced through his options. The cabin had only 2 exits, and both were likely covered. But during his years of isolation, he'd made modifications to his home that few knew about. Being a former firefighter had taught him the value of escape routes. Behind a false panel in his utility room, a narrow tunnel led to a concealed storm shelter 50 yards into the woods. Grace seemed to sense his thoughts, already nudging the puppies toward the utility room. Her training was evident in every movement, silent, efficient, purposeful. Snow, Ash, and Ember followed their mother's lead without a sound, their own enhanced intelligence showing in their perfect coordination. "Your silence is not encouraging, Mr. Hayes," Werner's voice came again, harder now. "My men are authorized to use whatever means necessary to recover my property. You have 5 minutes to respond." The sound of weapons being readied echoed through the night. Peter moved quickly, gathering essential supplies into a backpack, food, water, first aid kit, and the crucial evidence from the USB drive. The map fragment from Grace's collar showed a maintenance access point to the underground facility. If they could reach it, they might find the proof needed to expose Nexus dynamics. Just then, his phone vibrated, a text from Sarah Thompson, the store owner's daughter who worked at the local newspaper. "Dad told me about Werner. Found something big. Meeting arranged with federal agents tomorrow morning. Stay safe tonight." Peter allowed himself a small smile. The pieces were falling into place. A spotlight suddenly illuminated the cabin's interior. Peter dropped to the floor, crawling toward the utility room where Grace and the puppies waited. The false panel was already open. Grace had figured it out herself, another sign of her extraordinary capabilities. As Peter sealed the panel behind them, the first sounds of forced entry echoed through the cabin. The tunnel was narrow but well maintained. Peter had built it to withstand the worst of Wyoming's weather, never imagining it would serve this purpose. Grace led the way, her enhanced vision perfect in the darkness. The puppies followed silently, their movements sure despite their young age. Peter brought up the rear, hearing the muffled sounds of Werner's men discovering their escape. As they emerged into the night forest, Peter could see more vehicles arriving at his cabin. Werner had underestimated him, expected him to be an easy target. But a lifetime of running into danger while others ran away had prepared Peter for this moment. They had the evidence, they had a plan, and most importantly, they had each other. Grace turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting the distant lights. In them, Peter saw not just intelligence, but trust and determination. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The storm shelter would keep them safe until morning, and then they would bring the truth about Nexus dynamics into the light. The pre-dawn hours cast long shadows through the trees as Peter and his canine family made their way toward the Miller property. The storm shelter had provided safe refuge through the night, giving them time to rest and plan. Grace moved with renewed purpose, leading them along a path that seemed invisible to human eyes, but was clear to her enhanced senses. In the distance, emergency vehicles' lights flashed silently. Sarah had come through, not just with federal agents, but with a full task force. Her message had confirmed that years of suspicious activities around Nexus Dynamics had finally caught someone's attention. All they needed now was concrete evidence. The Puppies had proven themselves extraordinary during their night in hiding. Snow, with her pristine white coat, had an uncanny ability to detect approaching vehicles long before they were visible. Ash demonstrated remarkable problem-solving skills, helping them navigate blocked paths. And Ember seemed to possess an almost supernatural awareness of safe routes, leading them away from danger several times. As they approached the hidden entrance shown on the map, Peter heard the unmistakable sound of helicopters approaching. Dawn was breaking, painting the sky in shades of hope. Grace's posture changed as they neared the maintenance access point. This was familiar territory for her, but not a place of good memories. The entrance was concealed beneath a seemingly abandoned shed, exactly where the map indicated. Peter's old toolbox symbol, combined with the information from Grace's collar, helped him understand the locking mechanism. With a satisfying click, the door opened, revealing a sterile corridor that contrasted sharply with the rustic exterior. Grace's training became evident as she navigated the underground facility with precise confidence. The Puppies stayed close, their enhanced capabilities allowing them to move silently despite their youth. Peter followed, documenting everything with his phone's camera, the laboratories, the testing areas, the endless rows of data servers. They encountered no resistance. Warner's focus on the cabin had left the facility vulnerable. In a central control room, Peter found what they needed: servers full of research data, surveillance footage, and detailed records of every experiment. Grace led him to a specific terminal, pawing at the keyboard until he understood this was where her data was stored. Suddenly, alarms blared through the facility. On the security monitors, Peter watched Warner arrive with his remaining men, their vehicles skidding to a halt outside the main entrance. The elderly man's face was contorted with rage as he realized his secret facility had been breached. But Warner was too late. Federal agents were already surrounding the complex, their vehicles converging from all directions. Sarah Thompson stood with them, press credentials visible, accompanied by other journalists. The truth about Nexus Dynamics would not stay hidden any longer. Through the facility's cameras, Peter watched the scene unfold. Warner's arrest was anticlimactic, the powerful man in his sophisticated wheelchair suddenly looking small as agents presented their warrants. His network of influence, built on secrecy and intimidation, crumbled in the face of undeniable evidence. Grace stood watching the monitors, her puppies gathered around her. In her eyes, Peter saw not triumph, but relief, the end of a long journey she had planned with remarkable intelligence. She had chosen him specifically, recognizing the toolbox symbol from her time in the facility, knowing his background would make him the perfect ally. The facility's lights suddenly shifted to emergency power, and Peter knew it was time to leave. They made their way back to the surface, emerging into full daylight. Sarah was the first to spot them, alerting the agents who had been briefed about Grace's significance. The Puppies, despite their extraordinary abilities, acted just like normal young dogs in the morning sun, playing and tumbling in the grass. Weeks later, Peter sat on his cabin's porch, watching Snow, Ash, and Ember chase each other through the yard. Grace lay beside his chair, finally at peace. The Nexus Dynamics case had made national headlines, a story of corporate greed, illegal experimentation, and most importantly, the unbreakable bond between humans and dogs. Warner and his organization faced multiple federal charges. The evidence Peter and Grace had gathered proved instrumental in shutting down similar operations across the country. Sarah's articles had brought everything to light, earning her a prestigious journalism award. But the real victory was simpler and more personal. Peter's cabin was no longer a place of isolation, but a home filled with life and purpose. Grace and her puppies were safe, their extraordinary abilities now used for search and rescue work, helping others under Peter's guidance. They had become a family, bound together by trust, courage, and the kind of love that could overcome any obstacle. As the sun set over the Rockies, Peter reflected on how a single act of kindness on a stormy night had changed everything. Grace rested her head on his lap, her intelligent eyes meeting his. In them, he saw not just the remarkable result of scientific advancement, but something far more valuable, the pure, unconditional love of a dog for her family, enhanced or not. Dear listeners, we hope Peter and Grace's extraordinary journey has touched your hearts. We've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories that explore the unique bond between humans and animals. Find it by clicking the link to your left. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a like. Every day, we bring you unique stories that explore life's complexities and the power of compassion. Don't miss our upcoming content. We look forward to reading your comments. End of story.